They built an entire psychological narrative around you. Not a narrative based on who you truly were, but one built on who they needed you to be. In their minds, you were the struggling underdog, the person who would always need their approval, their validation, and their permission before taking the next step. That belief became the foundation of their confidence because it allowed them to see themselves as the winner, the authority, the gatekeeper standing between you and everything you wanted. But then something happened that shattered their reality. You stopped announcing your plans. You stopped seeking permission. You stopped explaining yourself to people who had already decided who you were. While they were busy maintaining an image of control, you were quietly building something real. And when the results finally appeared, they arrived without warning. Listen carefully, because this is where cognitive dissonance begins. Most people think enemies become upset when someone succeeds. That's only part of the story. What truly breaks them is when the person they underestimated succeeds outside of the system they created. They can handle competition. They can handle small victories. What they cannot handle is discovering that they were never as important as they believed. The moment you reached a level they thought was impossible, something inside them started to collapse. Not because you crossed their finish line, but because you proved their finish line never mattered. The race they spent years obsessing over was never the race you were running. Let that sink in for a moment. Everything they believed about themselves depended on one dangerous assumption: that they controlled access to your future. They believed they held the key. They believed they controlled the door. They believed your progress depended on their approval. But the day you achieved something undeniable without consulting them, their entire identity was forced into a confrontation with reality. And that's exactly what this video is about. Because there is a unique kind of shock that happens when people realize the person they looked down on was never beneath them at all. There is a unique kind of panic that happens when someone discovers they spent years guarding a gate that was never connected to your path. By the end of this video, you'll understand why their reality shattered the moment you moved in silence, and why the level you've reached now is something they can never take away. Number 1. The illusion of gatekeeping. One of the hardest truths for people to accept is that many of those who opposed you were never fighting for success itself. They were fighting for the feeling of being above someone else. That's why they became so invested in controlling access, controlling information, controlling opportunities, and sometimes even controlling how you saw yourself. Their greatest source of confidence wasn't their own growth. It was the belief that they stood between you and your future. Think about it. Some people build entire identities around being the person others need. Not because they genuinely want to help, but because dependency gives them power. As long as they can convince themselves that your progress requires their approval, they can maintain the illusion that they are indispensable. And for a while, it looked convincing. Maybe they had more connections. Maybe they had more money. Maybe they had more experience. Maybe they occupied positions that seemed important. They looked like the people holding the keys. They looked like the people deciding who wins and who loses. But here's what they failed to understand. Real power doesn't come from controlling doors. Real power comes from becoming the kind of person who can build new ones. That's the difference. While they were focused on protecting their position, you were focused on developing yourself. While they were trying to control outcomes, you were learning skills. While they were trying to maintain appearances, you were creating substance. And because they misunderstood where true power comes from, they completely miscalculated you. Listen, people who rely on gatekeeping always make the same mistake. They assume everyone else is playing the same game they are. They assume everyone wants access to their approval. They assume everyone is trying to enter the room they've spent years protecting. But what happens when the chosen one stops knocking? What happens when the person they expected to beg for entry quietly builds something outside their system? That's where everything begins to fall apart. Because the gatekeeper suddenly discovers that the gate was never the source of value. The value was always the person. Let that sink in. The moment you stopped chasing validation, the moment you stopped proving yourself to people who had already underestimated you, the entire dynamic shifted. Suddenly, Their position didn't carry the same weight. Their opinions didn't have the same authority. Their approval didn't have the same influence. And they felt it. You felt it too, didn't you? The subtle changes, the strange reactions, the uncomfortable silence, the forced smiles, the sudden curiosity about your life from people who never supported you before. Because when someone realizes they no longer control the narrative, panic begins to surface. Not always openly, not always dramatically. Sometimes it appears as criticism. Sometimes it appears as dismissiveness. Sometimes it appears as pretending not to care. But underneath all of it is the same uncomfortable realization. They're losing control. And that's terrifying for people who built their identity around having it. Here's what they never expected. They assumed that if they withheld support, you would fail. They assumed that if they ignored you, you would disappear. They assumed that if they blocked opportunities, your journey would stop. Instead, every obstacle became part of your preparation. Every rejection taught you something. Every setback strengthened you. Every closed door pushed you toward a path that was uniquely yours. This is why so many chosen ones eventually experience a breakthrough that appears sudden to everyone else. The breakthrough isn't sudden. The breakthrough is simply the visible result of years of invisible work. Years of growing in private. Years of healing in private. Years of building in private. Years of continuing when nobody believed in you. And when that breakthrough finally arrives, the gatekeepers are often the most shocked people in the room. Why? Because they genuinely believe their approval mattered more than your potential. They genuinely believe their permission mattered more than your purpose. They genuinely believed they were standing between you and your destiny. But destiny has a way of exposing illusions. And the greatest illusion of all was the belief that your future belonged to them. It never did. It never will. The truth is that many of the people who tried to control your path were never as powerful as they appeared. Their influence only worked as long as you believed they were necessary. The moment you discovered your own strength, the entire structure began to collapse. And that's why they're struggling now. Not because you broke their rules. Not because you challenged their authority. But because you revealed something they never wanted to face. You succeeded without their permission. And in doing so, you exposed the truth that terrifies every false gatekeeper. They were never controlling your future. They were only controlling the story they told themselves about it. And that story has finally come to an end. Number 2, operating in absolute silence. If there was one decision that completely dismantled their ability to stop you, it was this. You stopped broadcasting your next move. Most people don't realize how much power exists in silence until they witness what happens when someone succeeds without warning. The people who doubted you expected updates. They expected clues. They expected emotional reactions. They expected access to information they could analyze, criticize, discourage, or use against you. What they never expected was complete silence. And that's exactly why they lost their advantage. Listen. When toxic people believe they have influence over your life, they pay attention to everything. They study your words. They monitor your progress. They look for weaknesses. They search for signs of uncertainty. Not because they want to help, but because information gives them opportunities to interfere. The moment you announce every plan before it's finished, you invite opinions into a process that should be protected. You felt this before, didn't you? The excitement of sharing a new goal, the hope of receiving encouragement, the desire to celebrate a future victory before it arrives, only to watch the energy shift, only to notice the subtle doubt, only to hear the discouraging comments disguised as concern, only to feel your momentum weaken after exposing something that should have remained private. The chosen one eventually learns a lesson that changes everything. Not every seed needs an audience while it's growing. Some victories require darkness before they can reach the light. And that's exactly what you did. While they believed they knew your situation, your real work was happening behind the scenes. While they assumed nothing was changing, foundations were being built. While they convinced themselves you were standing still, entire chapters of your life were quietly transforming. That's why your success felt so sudden to them. But let's tell the truth. It wasn't sudden. It only appeared sudden because they were no longer receiving updates. There's a difference. The construction was happening every day. The discipline was happening every day. The healing was happening every day. The preparation was happening every day. They just weren't invited to witness it. And that drove them crazy. Because people who depend on controlling outcomes need visibility. They need information. They need access. They need to feel involved in the process, even if their involvement is negative. Silence removes all of that. Silence creates uncertainty. Silence creates distance. Silence removes opportunities for interference. Most importantly, silence forces people to confront the reality that your life no longer revolves around their awareness. That's the part many of them couldn't handle. It wasn't just that you succeeded. It was that they didn't see it coming. They weren't prepared. They didn't have time to create doubt. They didn't have time to spread negativity. They didn't have time to position themselves inside the story. The outcome was already complete before they even realized a game was being played. Now watch this. When a person is used to feeling powerful through influence, unexpected success feels like a personal attack on their identity. Suddenly they start asking questions. When did this happen? How did they do it? Who helped them? What am I missing? Those questions aren't always driven by curiosity. Many times they're driven by panic. Because deep down they understand what your silence revealed. It revealed that you no longer needed external validation to move forward. That's a dangerous realization for anyone who built their position around being needed. For years they believed they had a front-row seat to your journey. They believed they understood your limitations. They believed they could predict your future based on your past. But silence disrupted every assumption. Without information, they were forced to guess. Without access, they were forced to speculate. Without control, they were forced to watch. And by the time they understood what was happening, the outcome was already irreversible. Let that sink in. One of the greatest forms of power is allowing your results to speak before your plans ever do. Not because you're hiding, not because you're afraid, but because some things become stronger when they're protected from unnecessary noise. The truth is that silence wasn't weakness. Silence was strategy. Silence was wisdom. Silence was discernment. While they were watching for announcements, you were creating evidence. While they were waiting for promises, you were producing results. While they were focused on appearances, you were focused on transformation. And that's why they never had a chance to stop what was coming. Because by the time they heard about your elevation was already complete. The move had been made. The foundation had been built. The victory had already arrived. And there was absolutely nothing left for them to sabotage. Number 3. Removing their favorite excuses. For a long time, the people who underestimated you had an answer for everything. Every small victory you achieved came with an explanation that protected their ego. If something good happened in your life, it was luck. If an opportunity appeared, it was favoritism. If someone recognized your value, it was because you were in the right place at the right time. They always found a way to minimize your progress, because accepting your growth would have forced them to question their own assumptions. And that's what they were really protecting. Not the truth. Their version of the truth. Listen, people can dismiss potential. They can dismiss dreams. They can dismiss plans. They can even dismiss early success. But eventually there comes a point where the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. That's the moment they fear most. Because once success becomes undeniable, the excuses start running out. Think about how many times they convinced themselves you would fail. They expected the business to collapse. They expected the relationship to fall apart. They expected the opportunity to disappear. They expected the momentum to fade. They expected life to prove them right. Instead, the opposite happened. The results kept growing. The doors kept opening. The peace kept increasing. The confidence kept expanding. And with every new achievement, another excuse died. That's why some people become strangely quiet when your life begins to improve. Not because they suddenly became supportive, Because they're running out of explanations. The narrative they spent years building no longer matches reality. And be honest, you've probably seen this happen. The same people who once questioned your abilities suddenly stop making predictions. The same people who laughed at your vision suddenly stop talking about it altogether. The same people who were certain you would never make it suddenly become uncomfortable whenever your success enters the conversation. Why? Because certainty disappears when reality proves you wrong. Here's where it gets deeper. Many of them weren't just doubting your future. They were using your struggles as evidence for their own superiority. As long as you remained stuck, they felt validated. As long as you remained behind, they felt ahead. As long as you remained uncertain, they felt secure. Your growth threatened more than their opinions. It threatened their identity. That's why your success created such intense cognitive dissonance. They had already decided who you were. The problem is that reality refused to cooperate. Let that sink in. When someone spends years believing they're more capable than you, more intelligent than you, more deserving than you, they create a mental framework that feels permanent. Every future prediction becomes filtered through that framework. Then one day, the person they underestimated starts producing results they can't explain. Suddenly their worldview starts cracking. Because now they have two choices. Either admit they were wrong, or continue denying what's right in front of them. And many people struggle with that decision far longer than you'd imagine. This is why some individuals will keep searching for hidden reasons behind your success. They'll look for shortcuts. They'll look for special treatment. They'll look for secret advantages. They'll look for anything that allows them to avoid the obvious answer. The obvious answer is that you earned it. The obvious answer is that your growth was real. The obvious answer is that the strength they dismissed was actually authentic. But accepting that truth requires humility. And humility becomes difficult when pride has been steering the wheel for years. Now watch this. The most frustrating part for them isn't your success itself. It's the fact that your success exposed their lack of insight. Every achievement becomes evidence that they misjudged you. Every milestone becomes proof that their assessment was flawed. Every breakthrough becomes a reminder that they never truly understood who they were dealing with. That's why your elevation feels personal to them. Not because you're attacking them. Not because you're competing with them. But because your existence now contradicts the story they told themselves. And stories collapse when reality becomes stronger than belief. The truth is, there comes a point when success reaches a level where excuses simply can't survive anymore. Not because everyone suddenly supports you. Not because everyone finally understands you. But because the evidence becomes too heavy to ignore. The results speak louder than the rumors. The accomplishments speak louder than the criticism. The reality speaks louder than the narrative. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. The very people who once claimed you weren't capable are forced into silence. Not because they changed, but because the truth finally became impossible to argue against. The excuses are gone. The denial is exhausted. The evidence is overwhelming. And deep down, whether they'll ever admit it publicly or not, they now understand something they spent years trying to avoid. Your power was real all along. Number 4, the mirror of their inaction. Here's the part they never saw coming. Most people assume that when someone becomes uncomfortable with your success, it's because they're jealous of what you've gained. Sometimes that's true. But in many cases, the deeper wound has nothing to do with your achievement itself. The real discomfort comes from what your achievement forces them to see about themselves. You became a mirror. For years, some of these individuals spent enormous amounts of energy focusing on you. They watched your setbacks, analyzed your mistakes, discussed your failures, and convinced themselves that your future was already written. Every struggle you experienced became proof that they were right about you. Every delay reinforced their belief that they were somehow ahead. What they failed to recognize was that while they were investing attention in your life, you were investing effort into changing yours. That's why your success hits differently. It isn't simply a reminder of what you've accomplished. It's a reminder of what they chose not to do. Think about it. While they were talking about possibilities, you were taking action. While they were waiting for certainty, you were learning through experience. While they were protecting their ego from failure, you were accepting failure as part of growth. Those choices may not have looked significant in the moment, but over time they created a gap that became impossible to ignore. The painful reality is that time rewards builders. Not immediately, and not always visibly, but eventually. Every hour spent learning, healing, practicing, and improving compounds into something meaningful. Every hour spent gossiping, criticizing, comparing, or obsessing over someone else's journey produces very little in return. Most people don't notice this difference at first because growth is often invisible while it's happening. But one day the results become visible, and that's when reality starts asking uncomfortable questions. When they look at your life now, they're not only seeing your progress. They're seeing years of decisions reflected back at them. They're seeing the opportunities they ignored, the risks they avoided, the discipline they never developed, and the dreams they kept postponing. That's why some people become strangely defensive when confronted with another person's success. The success itself isn't attacking them. It's simply exposing the distance between what they wanted and what they were willing to do. And here's where it gets even deeper. Many chosen ones spend years in seasons that look unremarkable from the outside. There is no applause, no recognition, and often very little evidence that anything is changing. People assume nothing is happening because they only understand visible growth. What they don't understand is that transformation usually begins beneath the surface. Roots develop before trees appear. Foundations are laid before buildings rise. Character is forged long before achievement becomes visible. While others were evaluating where you were, life was preparing you for where you were going. That's why your rise appeared sudden. Not because it happened overnight, but because they weren't paying attention to the process. They only noticed the outcome. They missed the nights you kept going when nobody believed in you. They missed the sacrifices. They missed the discipline. They missed the moments when quitting would have been easier than continuing. All they saw was the finished result, and because they missed the preparation, the success felt impossible to explain. Now they are left facing a difficult truth. The greatest obstacle in their lives was never you. It was their own distraction, their own complacency, their own decision to watch instead of build. And deep down they know it. That's why your presence affects them differently now. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to argue. You don't need to remind anyone of what happened. Your life has already become the evidence. Every step forward reminds them that while they were focused on your journey, you were focused on your growth. While they were waiting for your collapse, you were preparing for your elevation. And that realization is far more painful than losing a competition, because it forces them to confront something they can no longer blame on anyone else. Number 5, irreversible elevation. What unsettles them most isn't the fact that you've risen. It's the realization that there is no realistic way to reverse it. For years, many of these people lived with the assumption that your success would be temporary. They believed every breakthrough would eventually fade. They believed every opportunity would eventually disappear. They believed every positive change in your life was fragile and dependent on circumstances. In their minds, time would eventually prove them right. But that's not what happened. Because what you've built isn't based on appearances. It's based on transformation. And there's a massive difference between the two. Appearances can disappear overnight. Status can disappear overnight. Recognition can disappear overnight. But when a person genuinely changes, when they develop discipline, wisdom, discernment, emotional control, resilience, and confidence, those things don't simply vanish because someone wants them to. Those qualities become part of who they are. That's what many of your critics failed to understand. They were watching for external signs of success while completely overlooking the internal evolution that created it. They saw the result, but missed the foundation. They saw the elevation, but missed the preparation. They saw the reward, but ignored the years of growth that made the reward possible. And now they're facing a reality that feels deeply uncomfortable. The version of you they understood no longer exists. Let that sink in. The person they thought they could manipulate is gone. The person they thought they could intimidate is gone. The person they expected to remain dependent on their approval is gone. The person who constantly explained themselves, defended themselves, and sought validation has been replaced by someone entirely different. Not because success changed you, because growth revealed you. That's why this elevation feels irreversible. It's not connected to a single achievement. It's not connected to a specific job, relationship, opportunity, or financial milestone. Those things matter, but they aren't the deepest reason you've advanced. The deepest reason is that you've become someone capable of creating new opportunities, even if old ones disappear. That's real power. Real power isn't having one door open. Real power is becoming the kind of person who can build another door if one closes. The people who underestimated you don't know how to process that reality because they spent years focusing on circumstances while you were focused on capacity. They measured power by position. You learned that power comes from preparation. They measured success by visibility. You learned that success begins with identity. Now watch this. This is where many chosen ones finally find peace. Not when everyone apologizes. Not when everyone admits they were wrong. Not when every critic suddenly becomes a supporter. That rarely happens the way people imagine. Peace arrives when you realize that your future is no longer connected to their opinion of you. Their approval can't elevate you. Their disapproval can't stop you. Their predictions can't define you. Their narratives can't contain you. Once you truly understand that, something shifts forever. You stop reacting. You stop proving. You stop explaining. You stop carrying the burden of being misunderstood. Because you finally understand that people can only see you through the limits of their own awareness. Some individuals will spend years trying to fit you into an outdated version of yourself because accepting your growth would require them to update their understanding of reality. And many never do. That's okay. Their inability to recognize your transformation doesn't erase it. The truth remains the truth whether they acknowledge it or not. That's why this chapter is so powerful. The elevation you're experiencing isn't temporary momentum. It isn't a lucky streak. It isn't an accident that appeared out of nowhere. It's the natural result of everything you've survived, everything you've learned, everything you've healed from, and everything you've built in silence. The person who emerged from those experiences is fundamentally different from the person who entered them. And deep down they know it. That's what creates the final layer of cognitive dissonance. They're still trying to interact with the old version of you while standing in front of someone who has completely outgrown that identity. They're trying to apply old assumptions to a new reality. They're trying to predict a future using information that no longer applies. But the story has already changed. The level has already changed. The standards have already changed. And whether they accept it or not, your elevation has reached a point where it cannot be undone. The only thing left for them to do now is adjust to a reality they never expected to see. A reality where the person they underestimated became impossible to ignore.